Well, hello everyone. This is Steve Strani. We're just getting started here and letting a few more people gather. So we'll be getting started in a minute or two with our webinar for key factors for successful uptake of biosimilars in Europe and the US.
Hello, everybody. This is Michael Riley, and I would like to welcome our panelists to join us at this moment. As you just heard from Steve, who'll be moderating the program, we're letting a few additional people get on as they're starting to get on at 10 o'clock, and we will start in about a minute, but I'd like to welcome the panel at this point and get ready to go. Dr. McKibben, are you on?
Can you see me? I should have a thumbnail here.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have your picture yet.
Really? Can anybody see me? Can anybody hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
There's Chad. Hey, Chad.
I can see you too.
Eric.
Okay, good.
Hi there.
Okay, Eric, see you at the moment.
I don't see you, Michael.
I can see you now, Ralph. See
Okay.
your picture
I'm in
and
the,
can hear you.
I'm in the far left.
You hear me and see
I
me.
have Michael's thumbnail, but no picture. I don't know.
Dr. Schneider, can you see my picture?
I can.
Yeah, same here. I can see and hear everyone.
I can see everybody here.
Great. Can't see Eric right now. All right, I'm going to go ahead and begin just in the interest of everyone's time. I would like to thank everybody for joining us for today's webinar, Key Factors for Successful Biosimilars, the Europe and the US. As we're kind of getting kicked off here, I want to start by acknowledging the amount of work that goes into putting together a program like today's. And in particular, I would like to recognize the efforts of Laja Tong with GaBI, who is co-hosting this with ASBM. I would like to also thank the panelists who have generously given their time and expertise to today's webinar, and especially Eric Hargan, a former colleague of mine, for sharing his unique perspective. And finally, and most importantly, I would like to thank all of you who have taken time out of your schedules to join us today, really from all over the world on a very important topic. And I hope that by the end of the next 2 hours, you will have learned something that will make this a valuable use of your time. The program today, again, this is the first in a series of webinars that we are going to be doing with GaBI, Key Factors for Successful Uptake of Biosimilars. There is a lot of talk both within the US and globally about biosimilars, and we really wanted to start by talking about the great things that are happening with biosimilars, and specifically focusing in on Europe, where I think everyone acknowledges the successes, but also bringing a little light on where we are with the US. The next in the series of webinars will be on July 20th. That will be focusing specifically on non-medical switching. And at this point, I would like to turn it over to our moderator, Steve Strani. Steve is a partner at Foley Hoag in Washington, D.C. He's unique in that he is both a physician and a lawyer. And for the past 25 years, Steve has been working, helping oversee complex legislative and regulatory actions involving Congress, the Centers for Medicare, CMS, the FDA, and other regulators globally. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve to walk us through the plan.
Well, good morning, everybody. For those of you that are on the East Coast of the United States, and good afternoon and good evening for those of you around the world today. My name again is Steve Strani, and I'm very pleased to serve as your moderator today, but even more pleased to be able to hear and interact with our speakers today. We've got a great panel that represents a very wide range of perspectives and thoughts on biosimilars. As Michael mentioned, our focus today is going to be on key factors for success in biosimilar uptake. And our emphasis for today's discussion is going to be on the European market and the US market. And as I think many of you know, and as we'll hear throughout the discussions, there's actually quite a bit to celebrate in both of those spheres on the advances that have been made in a relatively short period of time. If you can advance the slide for me, we have a range of presenters today that include patient perspectives, physicians, pharmacists, regulators, advocates, and industry. And as you see here, that we have prepared remarks from all of our speakers. And then at the end of our time together today, we're going to have a panel discussion with questions. What I would urge all of you to consider and to help us with is to help come up with some questions for us to pose to the panel. There is a question function on the platform for the webinar, and any question that you type in there we'll be able to see. And what I can promise all of you is that if you take the time to put together a question, if we're unable to address it during the time constraints of the webinar today, we'll get back to you afterwards with an email response. So with that, again, if you could advance the slide, I'd like to introduce our first and keynote speaker today, who I'm very pleased to introduce you to the Honorable Eric Hargan. Eric is the founder and CEO of a group called the Hargan Group, which is a full-service consulting firm in the healthcare sector. And he also serves on multiple boards in the healthcare arena. His name is likely very familiar to a lot of you. Eric has some very unique insights and perspectives to share with us and to contribute to our discussion. He served at the very highest positions in the US federal government, focusing on healthcare policy, healthcare implementation, and oversight. Specifically, he served as both the acting secretary and the deputy secretary of the US Department of Health and Human Services between 2017 and 2021. This put him in direct leadership positions involving the FDA, the agency that oversees our largest federal health programs like Medicare and other responsibilities. So with that, I'll turn things over to Eric.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that warm introduction. to those of you who may not be as familiar, Deputy Secretary is essentially the number 2, the Chief Operating Officer of the department, so in charge of the regulatory, budget, and operations of the department. It's actually my second time around. As Michael had said, we're former colleagues. We actually worked at HHS together under a George W. Bush administration, so at HHS as well, so for a number of years. So good to be here, and going to talk today about something that the impact of biosimilars on our healthcare system in the U.S. and sort of where these things we see them going forward, having sort of bracketed on both sides of the passage of the BPCIA, having been under George W. and then coming back and the previous administration, sort of trying to offer some perspectives about where things have gone and also in between. So there's me, as you can see me down there as well. Now, why is increasing biosimilar uptake important? As I'm sure all of you know, biologics are a large component of US drug spending. And this has only gone up over time as a percentage. Now, why is this important? Speaking from a governmental perspective, this is obviously something that HHS watches carefully. And it's known within the department very well. So there's a lot of attention on biologics, biosimilars within the department, both from the point of view of the product as well as the administration of the drugs and biologics on both sides. So this factor and the fact that not just industry but also the department keep a close watch over the spending growth and where things are going, where trends are going on this. Now, obviously, in the middle of this, you look at what the impact is going to be on savings to the U.S. market. As I think everyone had seen, the Medicare trustees report extended the deadline for the insolvency of the Medicare program a couple of years, pretty recently, due to some what I would regard as one-time factors. But these kinds of things are on the mind of HHS and payers more broadly. And you look at the impact of the savings that can happen with biosimilars, this is significant. I mean, you look at the estimation here, 5.9% of projected total US spending down. So the savings are pretty significant over a relatively short span of time. And the idea, of course, is that particularly within the biosimilars area, the more the merrier. The more biosimilars are in a particular area, the better the savings will be. And that was something certainly that we had advocated within our administration. And I think that's not something that has been sort of rowed back in the current administration, is the notion that these are areas in which advancing the opportunities for biosimilars and sort of keeping this going is a great idea, that you really don't mess with what's working. We had continued on what we had inherited from the prior administration, and I think the current administration is, I don't see any sign that they're wavering in that so far. So, and you look at what's happening here, it's something that's very familiar to everyone, the notion that what you're dealing with is that the brand name biologics are seeing primarily the downward pressure from the introduction of biosimilars, and the savings are really coming from that. So now, this was something that was in our minds under Bush and also under all the administrations, is the notion that Europe was really ahead of the United States in terms of the adoption of frameworks for biosimilars, significantly ahead in terms of years. So naturally, Europe has some advances in terms of numbers of approvals over the US. A significant number of these are done in Europe. And we had seen this going on. This was something that, especially given the very large size of the healthcare sector in the US compared to the overall economy, this is a thing that's on everyone's mind, regardless of where you fall in the sort of policy continuum about where you think the size of the healthcare economy should be, whether you think it's just a kind of Goldilocks, it's not too large, not too small, whether it's too large, too small. In any case, the idea that the introduction of biosimilars is not to be encouraged and hailed, that's not something that we had considered at HHS. Like that's very much in line with where they want to go on this. It was just a matter that there had not been a path in the way that the EU had until it was statutorily established in a much firmer way in BPCIA. And of course, I don't believe the first biosimilar was approved until 2015. So in the US. So we really are looking at a trailing factor inside the US compared to the EU. But as noted here, the US is catching up, and this is a good thing from an American point of view. There's a lot of approvals that have been happening. And you see that, and this might be naturally so, US is catching up. 28 approved in the first 5 years, 11 approved by the EMA in its first 5 years. Now, you look at the gap there, and in many cases, regulators inside the government, say a peer government, so you're looking at the US, Japan, the EU, they kind of look to each other and say, what are they doing? And not just in the general issue of the ongoing harmonization efforts that take place internationally, but people kind of look over their shoulders. It's a typical human reaction to see what are they doing. And I think that probably assisted the FDA in building out its framework and getting comfortable with the notion of biosimilars, was the fact that Europe had gone there first. And therefore, there has been an ability for the US to kind of go more quickly. In fact, back when I was there under Bush, there was a difficulty from the FDA's point of view in even being able to characterize biologics. And so they had a great deal of hesitancy about going in there with all the sugars and esters. I remember us having many conversations about the way that the biologics worked. But now, with greater comfort, you can see regulators have been much more able to sort of move forward on these things. And here we go. As I said, FDA approved its first biosimilar in 2015. You see now that we had an earlier pathway, but I don't think that people were particularly satisfied with the kind of firmness of it from a statutory point of view and from an implementational point of view. And also the FDA, and I'm sure it will irritate anyone from the EU, the FDA really wants to establish the gold standard. That's what the US FDA wants to be. Wants to have very high standards in this area, as high as they reasonably can, given their dual function of promoting and protecting public health. They want to achieve that balance. And the issue here had been, what are the standards going to be? And not just the standards from an agency integrity point of view, an agency mission point of view, but what are you going to do with biosimilars in the future? And how do you maintain patient confidence in biosimilars? To do that, you have to have high standards in the marketplace. And you have to have high standards from the regulators to make sure that patients don't lose confidence in this. This had been early days across the board at FDA, approval of all these kinds of in the drug or the biologic area, there had been characterized by, can I take this? Should I take this? Patient wariness, frankly, physician wariness in the space. But the use of high standards and the fact that the regulators kind of are pretty searching on these issues from their point of view, at least, means that the patients maintain confidence in this. And I think that that has been at least reflected from a departmental point of view. This has been a success so far. Here it is, the higher regulatory standard on this issue. This is just setting that out there. And interchangeability obviously is an even higher standard in the US from a regulatory point of view. And you look here, biosimilars, obviously, when I looked at the issues where costs had come down or projected to come down even more, this is how it happens. Gaining share in the therapeutic areas in which they're introduced. And of course, Medicare from a federal point of view, which was also, as Stephen noted, under my purview, keeps close track of these kind of things, especially given the oncoming insolvency, not bankruptcy. I won't go into the details there, but the insolvency of the Medicare program, unless it's fixed by Congress. And as you can see, the interesting thing here is that the uptake rates, even though it's a much newer concept in the US, the biosimilars are sort of later in time than the US, we're still seeing uptake rates that are relatively similar to the European rates. If you can see, sort of toggling back and forth between the two, you're seeing similarities in volume. It's not that low, although there's obviously great variance by classes, by types of biosimilars. You're still seeing relatively similar uptake rates in this space. And some of those you have to look at it and say, like, how are the incentives arrived at the US? Not necessarily a regulatory point of view. Sometimes it's going to be dealing with payers and the structure of payment within the US market, as opposed to a regulatory issue. Because these substantial savings, as I gestured to before, we are seeing prices driving down on innovator biologics. I think this 2019 number has increased $2.5 billion. Yes, there, 2020, there it is, $7.9 billion. And if I had to guess, these are on the low side. I mean, these are nice estimates, but I'm going to guess these are, if we saw a true issue here on savings, these would be more in this. And of course, as one would expect, price is a key factor in this area. That is, for patients, especially those who might be exposed to larger amounts of copays or just outright payment, for those that are sort of self-pay in the space, as few as those might be. And of course, here, and of course, the biosimilar area, it's different, because more the merrier in terms of the number of biosimilars. That the more you get in this area, the lower the lower the price, the higher the discount from more entrants in this. So because you're already seeing these savings, and because there are entrants coming in, I think that it has pretty much justified the regulators' attitude so far of maintaining high standards and high patient confidence in biosimilars, and this pretty good and similar uptake in the US to the EU in terms of biosimilars, and generating significant savings. So I think that, a rare story inside US healthcare, from at least my point of view, from an old regulator and government guy's point of view, is one of these situations where something's not on fire within the US system. So, and again, I'm speaking from my own perspective. I know we have a lot of people who are going to be speaking on this issue, but at least from my perspective inside, that this has been a success from the point of view of the build out and the uptake of this, and the effects of that uptake on the savings on the other side of the house within at least the governmental system, and I'm sure going further into the private payer system as well, that you see both on the regulatory point of view has been able to, the reforms on the regulatory point of view and the build out there has resulted in a lowering of pressure on the healthcare finance side of the house, has increased uptake and patient acceptance. So I think that, as I say, so far so good on these sides of the things. I think, obviously what's coming up, I think one of the big elements is sort of farther down on this slide, which is interchangeability. When you see that there's another one coming online, and more to come, hopefully, is what's this going to do, and how will this change the market? Will it be a significant change, and what will it mean in this space? Will it be seen as sort of like, well, yeah, or will it have a more significant effect on uptake, patient confidence, and of course beyond that on the price and lowering the pressures in the space, the product space, that the public has felt, that the government has felt, and that I'm sure you all saw reified both in our administration in a number of pricing initiatives, rules, and laws, and also taking place under this current administration as well. So I know we waited a couple of minutes, so I'll just end it there, and look forward to engaging on these topics in the future.
Well, thank you so much for those those observations and perspectives. It's now my pleasure to introduce someone who you heard from at the beginning, Michael Riley. We are very lucky in the biologics sector to have an advocate as experienced as Michael to help guide stakeholders through. Michael serves as the Executive Director of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. He's served in this role for over a dozen years since the inception of the organization. And in that role, he has been engaged with a wide range of stakeholders and regulators on a worldwide basis. Prior to joining ASBM, Michael was an active public servant. He served in the highest levels of the U.S. federal government, serving in a variety of roles in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services between 2002 and 2008. And this includes his role as the Associate Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He was responsible for policy development, policy oversight involving the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and CMS, the agency that oversees Medicare and Medicaid in the U.S. So with that, Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. And again, thanks to the panelists and the attendees. Eric talked to kind of kick this off about the government perspective on biosimilars, and in particular, to talk about kind of the successes and how the government views where biosimilars are today. Steve mentioned the worldwide involvement. ASBM from the very beginning, from when we were formed, and because in large part because of my background as a regulator, I thought it was really important to have an organization that was based upon providing data for regulators and for policymakers on a global scale. And so to that end, surveys have been an instrument that we have really used to be able to convey that information. We've conducted 15 surveys across 13 countries. And the one I'm going to focus on at the moment is the most recent survey, which is, I should say the most recent in Europe, which is the European survey, which was conducted in 2019. The most important part about the surveys, though, are to share the information. Who's the audience for the survey? The surveys were done in order to share information. This goes back to 2012. As Steve mentioned, ASBM was formed in 2010 after the BPCI was passed in the Affordable Care Act and the beginning of the pathway for the U.S. And as Steve mentioned, as Eric mentioned, you know, there was a lot of catching up for the U.S. to do, but we realized that it was important to be looking globally in terms of understanding kind of physician perspectives. So this survey and all the surveys have been shared directly with the countries, regulators, and health ministers where their surveys were conducted. The interesting thing about the particular survey that I'm going to be focusing on, the European survey, is it happened, it was presented one time, that was in Barcelona at ESMO in 2019, and then COVID happened. And so the ability to share that information with regulators is something that we actually are going to be doing going forward. And we thought this is a good opportunity to begin that process. So Eric mentioned, and I think we all acknowledge that Europe is really where biosimilars are viewed as kind of leading the way. And, you know, this webinar today is to talk about the U.S. catching up to Europe, but understanding, and you'll hear from other presenters about the successes of Europe in order to try to model and emulate after the European approach. you need to be able to understand what it is. And so we wanted to do a survey where we were essentially refreshing a survey from 2013, because obviously over the course of time, a lot has changed with biosimilars from that period of time, 2013 to 2019, and even to today, 2022. So we conducted this survey across 6 Western European countries. And as I mentioned, this survey was presented at Europe and ESMO. What was interesting was it was really well received within the European community, and in large part because of the pride they take in not only being acknowledged as the leaders when it comes to biosimilars, but also the way that they have become the leaders in biosimilars. And basically, we'll talk later on about some of the aspects of the European approach. I know Dr. Schneider will talk about some of those specific aspects, but essentially they have been fairly physician-directed and led, and it's really an important component. So probably the most important reveal from the survey, the 2019 survey, was that as we saw from 2013 to 2019, an increase in familiarity, which you would expect with physicians and biosimilars, we also saw an increase in physicians' belief that they should be maintaining control of treatment decision. Strong majority of physicians, if you look at the comparison, basically from 84% of physicians were comfortable prescribing biosimilars to treatment-naive patients. I think that a really important fact, we hear a lot in the US about barriers to uptake, and we hear about information and even about misinformation with regards to educating physicians. And we also have a US survey, which Dr. McKibben is going to share, but what we've seen that's consistent between Europe and the US is that physicians are both knowledgeable and comfortable with biosimilars. And that really does kind of undercut the notion that there's a lot of misinformation about there. In Europe in particular, physicians are very comfortable with them in terms of prescribing them. Again, when you look at switching, though, that's a different issue. 58% of physicians are uncomfortable with switching their patients to biosimilars for non-medical reasons in the European survey. And this percentage increases to 73% when asked about a third party initiating such a switch. Again, when you look at Europe, Europe is not monolithic. It's obviously a whole host of countries that have different healthcare systems, but there have been some common elements within those healthcare systems, and that is that they know that in order to get patient buy-in, you need to get physician buy-in, and that has been a cornerstone of the European approach. Again, when you look at the importance of authority to prevent a substitution, that is a physician being able to put do not dispense as written, 84% of those respondents considered it very important or critical, and that was up from 74% in the 2013 survey, which shows that even as they increase their overall confidence, they still think that they should be at the center of the decision making. And this is a really important point in terms of those countries trying to develop successful and sustainable biosimilars programs. You also see a strong majority of respondents feel that it is very important or critical for them, the physician, to decide which biologic is dispensed to their patients. That is an increase from 72% in 2013. So that's a full 10% increase in terms of decision makers, even as they increase their overall confidence. We also asked questions about tenders, and this was actually discussed in the European Commission meeting that occurred a few weeks later in Brussels in 2019, right after the survey was presented at ESMO. I attended that meeting, and there was a lot of discussion about the lessons that they had learned going forward from 2019 forward. And one was that you needed to make sure if you had tenders, you had multiple tenders, that you needed to not have sole winner tenders, and that tenders needed to be based upon factors other than simply price. And physicians, respondents reinforced that thought. That's this slide. So 83% feel it's very important or critical for national tender offers to consider factors besides price. This was recognized at that European Commission meeting in Brussels. Overall, the bottom line from the survey, and I think from the work that we've done both in the EU and the US, is that if you're going to try and build a program that is a successful and sustainable biosimilars program, you need to understand what are the principles and the foundational pieces of that program. And again, first and foremost in Europe is the physician's role in making decisions about the medicines that they are giving to their patients, and being able to make a decision regardless of not having government directed or payers directed. Ultimately, the survey that we conducted reveals that physicians have increased their familiarity with biosimilars, and even as they do, they basically still believe that they should be the ones making decisions. And this is really important. We will talk quite a bit about this topic actually in the next webinar, specifically looking at places where they have done non-medical switching programs where the government is directing the physician to what medicine is best for patients. So with that, I would like to turn it back to Steve. The surveys, all of our surveys are available on our website, the European survey and the other 15 that I mentioned. And I will turn it over to Steve and look forward to questions when we get the panel.
Oh, great. And thank you, Michael. And I'd like to, I've been watching the questions coming in. We're getting some great questions for the end of the program today, but I urge everyone to keep sending questions. We need as many as we can get. Our next speaker is Dr. Ralph McKibben, who I'm very pleased to introduce. He is a practicing physician and gastroenterologist in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He's also held many leadership positions in the physician community, including serving as past president of the Digestive Disease National Coalition. He's served as the past president of the Pennsylvania Society of Gastroenterology, and he currently serves as the chairman of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. Dr. McKibben has written extensively on insurance industry utilization management techniques and the implications for clinical care and for patients. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. McKibben.
Thank you very much. See if I can get the slides to go here. There we go, and that's me. I've been introduced, and thank you for the warm introduction. I appreciate it. I think to introduce myself, I'd just like to say, what is my perspective and what am I? Everyone here is not a physician. We all have different perspectives on what we do. Mr. Spiegel later is going to talk about advocacy and whatnot. But I am an advocate for physicians. And what does that mean? Physicians have a fiduciary responsibility to care for their patients. It's my ethical and moral responsibility to stand up for my patient and the relationship I have with them, even to the point where I get into trouble. I must do what's right. I am not looking to make profits for shareholders. I'm there to get the best care for my patient. And that is the key to the doctor-patient relationship. And that's probably the perspective where a lot of these physician surveys are coming from. You have to understand that what is the idea that the person there taking care of the patient, where are they coming from? How are they supposed to get the best care for their patient? And that's what this is about. So we did a survey, and again, the follow-up survey. This is just US data, and again, systems are different around the world. The survey was done last year. We had 401 participants across 12 specialties, fairly equally distributed. So this isn't a gastroenterology bias or rheumatology bias. Everyone was a prescriber of biologics. So these are the utilizers. We're not asking people who don't really know what they're talking about. So what kinds of issues did we look at in the survey? There's overlap amongst the surveys, but these are probably the key points, especially looking at some of the questions that are coming up as to why are we not adopting biosimilars at a faster rate or whatnot. So the question is, are we confident in the safety and the efficacy of the biosimilars? Do they work? Do we have the data that we know? Do we believe it? Substitution and switching. Is it a physician-directed, patient-directed, both, insurance company, et cetera? And do we need additional data to help us drive that decision? And that's important when you look at the data. I'll just give two concrete examples from practice. Ranitidine, or the Zantac medication, has been on the market for a long time. All of a sudden, something was found out. They pulled it from the market because of concerns of cancer. These are the kinds of concerns and anxieties we have. Do we have the data that we know to fully adopt or jump in head first, so to speak? Reimbursement policies are also part of this. As physicians, when we go and write a prescription, there's often a formulary, what's covered, what's not covered, what's the copay and deductible. In the US, we often have to do authorizations to get things to go forward. So the first question then is, are physicians confident in biosimilars? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. 44 or 45% are overwhelmingly highly confident, and somewhat confident, another 47%. So 92% of people believe that these medicines work, they do what they say they do, and they're safe to prescribe. So this is our baseline. And I think that this should be something we look at is, why would we deviate from that? If they work, what are the concerns that come up? So bouncing off of Michael's presentation about Europe, if you look at to the left, Canada, the EU, and 19, and the US, we all have similar and actually rising, perhaps, levels of confidence in biosimilar utilization. We feel it's good for new patients. If you haven't been exposed to anything, there's no issues of switching or changing, and this is something we believe will work. So we don't think that biosimilars aren't doing the job. We're comfortable with it, and we would write them for our patients. So if you have a patient, though, who's been stable on a biosimilar, would you switch them? So the answer is yes, but if we're leading the switch. And why would there be a concern here? Just to give a little bit of insight, the doctor-patient relationship is there. We have to, at least in the US, and I'm sure elsewhere, we have this ethical responsibility to explain risks and benefits to the patients. So is there some unknown questions about switching? Did it take a long time? Well, oftentimes these patients take years before they end up on a stabilizing regimen and get back to their life, get back to their job, their family, their children, etc. Is there a concern? Well, probably. 80% are comfortable switching if we come to an agreement with the patient, and we can do so. But that 20% reluctance is a factor here. So it's not that we don't think the biosimilar is working. I would say this raises the question of what is the information that we need to be fully confident in such a change. That brings up the category then, the interchangeable category. As in the United States, an interchangeable has, biosimilars had additional information submitted to show that you can make more than one switch from different agents with no concerns about side effects, etc. So this is the idea that it's not just something similar and we'll switch it and follow along and see how it goes, but perhaps then that we can switch this. So are we going to prescribe it? 57% more likely to use that. And 59% are even comfortable having the pharmacy substitute it, because we've had that additional data to say this medication is functionally the same, even though there may be some subtle similarities. We don't have to worry about additional side effects, impurities, and things like that that could come into play. When it comes to additional switching, perhaps on the basis of insurance companies, what we call third-party switching. In other words, it wasn't made in the doctor-patient relationship in the room, but someone is telling us that we have to switch. 60% of people are not comfortable with third-party switching. And I think some of that has to do with transparency, meaning we don't know exactly what the data was. The insurance company or the payer said, you're going to use this one. It wasn't discussed and presented. And so it makes us uncomfortable because of our fiduciary responsibility that we need to know what's going on. And having other people switch things and we may not even know it's happening makes us uncomfortable. We could be letting our patients down. This concept of physician and patient control was a global thing. If you look at the surveys, Latin America back in 2015, Australia, Canada, the EU as before, in the US, This is around the world. So this isn't a US payer system issue. This is, I believe, an inherent characteristic of being a physician, that I have this responsibility to do the right thing for you, and that's sort of the keystone of healthcare. So this is a universal concept. When you look at us as stakeholders and you meet with us, these are the issues that we have. So what can you do to make it more similar? I think that the multiple products, meaning there's choices out there, things that we can discuss. You can see 63% in the EU and 71% in the US are very comfortable with the idea of it's important or critical to have multiple choices, and somewhat important is still at least a quarter of people. And it's not important is a very small percentage of people. So this idea of having multiple products and choice, perhaps that's inherent in competition ideas, but the idea that we're not being railroaded just for money. Price is not the only factor. And it goes back to this, and I think these questions overlap. What other factors need to be out there? Well, we feel there is other information. It isn't detailed in this study, and maybe that's something we could do an additional survey, but there is additional information that we need. A lot of that is safety information, but the idea also that it continues to work, et cetera, is there. There are many different medications in the world. We've all heard stories of things being pulled from the market here and there. And those are the anxieties that physicians and patients have in this field. So, preferred biosimilar access. 81% of US physicians believe that patients would be best served having an access scenario which there's biosimilars could be used for new patients. We don't disagree with saving money for the system, ourselves, patients, et cetera. I think that's a good idea. There should be multiple products reimbursed so that people have choices as to what they can do if they've been stable for a long time and have a lot of possible stress and cost from changes or things not going well. That's there. And there should be no automatic substitution. This is, again, that 81%, the big majority of patients. The idea that only the government choosing biosimilar is going to be used is a small percentage. There is a 11% unsure, but I think, again, education, additional information, but it's going to take something for us to believe that a single agent choice is the right thing to do. So the survey was presented more in detail at DIA just recently in June. I was there for that, and I did get a lot of questions on that. This survey and other surveys are available on the website, so I think feel free to go there and look this stuff up. It's important, and I look forward to having more conversation as we come up. I'll turn this back over to Stephen. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. McKibben. Our next speaker is Professor Phil Schneider. Professor Schneider is a professor of pharmacy at The Ohio State University. And for those of you who know me, know that I grew up in the shadows of Ohio State at actually a rival high school of Professor Schneider's. But setting that aside, he's had multiple leadership positions in the pharmacy community. He served as past president of the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. He has served as the past vice president of the International Pharmaceutical Federation, and he currently serves as the International Advisory Board Chair of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. He also serves as a consultant and serves on multiple boards. So with that, Professor Schneider.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. And the purpose of this presentation is to share a review of policy considerations that were used in the EU that have been cited frequently as factors in the success in a sustainable biosimilar market, but also have been misinterpreted. And so we'll focus on what our findings were in an analysis of those policy considerations, as well as how those might have been misinterpreted. As Steve's pointed out, I have these experiences. I won't review those, but as Dr. McKibben has done, I guess, as a pharmacist, bringing our perspective in the table, we're partners in care, certainly advocating the responsible use of medicines, And our focus is to work collaboratively with prescribers to make sure that the medicines work, that patients aren't harmed by them. But as a third factor, making sure that we make the best use of limited resources in healthcare. And certainly biosimilars offer that opportunity to make responsible use of limited resources and make these life-saving medicines or life-changing medicines more available to patients. It's been mentioned previously that the EU is acknowledged as a leader in the approval and commercialization of biosimilars and looked on by others who are interested in spreading the adoption of biosimilars. And this is because they have the largest biosimilars market in the world, with about 60% of the biosimilars market, with many biosimilars being available. And market share can be as high as 91% for some of the products for which biosimilars have been available for a long period of time, and even for newer products approaching 50%. Because of this success, it's not surprising that people are very interested in the European experiences to provide examples for developing policies in other parts of the world. So in keeping with that premise, Michael Riley and I did an analysis of policy recommendations in the EU and published this as a white paper in the GaBI journal. And the objective of our review of these policies was to identify some of the principles that could be applied to developing an efficient and sustainable biosimilar market. And so I'd like to review those in this presentation. Some of the sources of information that we used in our review and analysis include these 5 previous studies that were done on biosimilar sustainability in Europe, ranging from 2014 to 2019. And you can see those studies listed on this slide. So it's been said, if you've seen one European country, you've seen one European country. There's a tendency for us to focus on the EU experience as a single entity, but in fact, there are differences within the 28 European Union members and their 3 economic areas there. So, and those similar differences are some of the following. There are different supply side and demand side incentives. There's different degrees of competition with each of the European countries, or lack of competition. Policies can be determined nationally or regionally or even at the hospital level, or various mixtures of those. So policies can be a little different for those reasons. And independent of the policies that are pursued, the data suggests that a biosimilar price and use also depends on the therapeutic area and the time that the biosimilar has been on the market. For example, single-use therapies tend to be a higher biosimilars adoption, whereas the treatment of chronic conditions for which patients have been stabilized, the uptake may be a little bit more limited because of the reluctance to switch a successfully treated patient. And we found that over time, the longer biosimilars have been on the market and the more that are on the market, the more they're likely to be used. So much of the focus of the attention to the European market has been on countries like Norway and Denmark because they have achieved substantial reductions in prices. And so regulators and policymakers and payers that are looking for significant savings in biologics often cite experiences in Norway and Denmark. But it's important to note that these are the only 2 European countries that have pursued national tender policies that encourage, if not obligate, prescribers to use the least expensive product in their patients. Denmark is will only reimburse a manufacturer for the lowest bidding price for a particular molecule, and these tenders are done on an annual basis. So that means the potential for a patient to switch therapies might occur every year. Norway is even more often cited as an example of price reductions based on their tendering process, but we found that ultimately the physician still has the responsibility to consider the use of a lower and less expensive product, but they will still pay for the product that's prescribed if the patient, it's felt that the patient needs that. And again, their tendering process occurs annually as well. However, if we look broadly at the European and extract lessons that we've learned from all of the countries in the EU, particularly the Western countries in Europe, they all have increased competition and focus on competition as a way to manage costs. And as a result of competition in the market, they're seeing reduced costs for both the originator product, but also for biosimilars compared to the price level before biosimilars were introduced. So price competition from biosimilars is having an impact on the cost of biologics and biosimilars. And we've observed an increase in the use of biosimilars with competition and expanding market access because of lower prices to more patients. And so that's a positive thing for a health service. And so it has alleviated budget pressures by providing headroom to fund novel innovations. So in other words, we're not driving costs so low that innovation is not encouraged by the pharmaceutical industry. So we need new products and we need more biosimilars. And in order to do that, there has to be a sufficient financial return on the investment that's taken to bring these products to market. So in our paper, we summarize some common principles across European markets. And even though they've been different in different countries, all the major European markets share these principles. One is automatic substitution for biologics is forbidden. In other words, payers can't determine what treatment the patient receives. The treatment is left between the prescriber and the patients for whom they're taking care of. All biologics, both the originators and biosimilars, are available for use and paid and reimbursed when they're prescribed. Reimbursement decisions are based on novel treatment that are independent from biosimilar use and uptake. In other words, there isn't an arbitrary effort to encourage biosimilar use only. That the treatment decision is made without financial incentives or obligations to the prescriber. And we've seen that the time to market for the approval of the first product sales for biosimilars is shorter than the time to get to market for the innovative product. So biosimilars are able to come to the market more quickly because of abbreviated pathways that exist, an abbreviated pathway that exists there. So we suggested in our white paper 6 principles that we would say are a gold standard. Mention was made of the FDA goal of being a gold standard for assuring safe medication use in the U.S. and biologics and biosimilars included. And this would be our principles that we would suggest. Policies should be designed to create incentives and to reward innovation for all type of biologics. We need new innovative reference products, new originators, but we also need more biosimilars. Healthcare financing must understand that biologics are more expensive medicines, and there's a lot of social benefits that are derived from biologic medicine. So while these costs are high, it's important to maintain being mindful of the cost of these therapies, but understand that they are more expensive and patients do benefit from them. That procurement practices must provide for multiple suppliers, and that tendering terms shouldn't be too frequent so that patients aren't encouraged to change therapies too often. Physicians who have responsibility and accountability for the care of their patients, as Dr. McKibben has pointed out, must have the autonomy to choose the most appropriate medicine for their patients, including making decisions when a switch is required. And it must also be something to which patients agree on. So we don't think automatic substitution is an appropriate principle on which to develop policies to There are concerns about identifying what medicine patients received, a reference product or one of a variety of biosimilars. So in our country, we have distinguishable non-proprietary names, but in the EU, they do not have that. And so brand name prescribing is important so that unintended switches don't occur and that we can identify adverse events when they occur through pharmacovigilance programs. And finally, policies that have the potential to undermine sustainability, such as measures that induce biosimilars uptake and promote preferential treatment and limit physician choices, should be avoided. And we identified 3 must-have principles. Physicians should have the freedom to choose between off-patent originator biologics and available biosimilars because they're responsible and accountable for acting in the best interest of their patients and are based on scientific evidence and clinical experience, not simply financial considerations, which are often the basis for policy decisions. Tenders should be designed to have multiple value-based contracts criteria besides price. Some of those include education services, available dosage strengths, and with self-administered medicines, the way the medication is being administered will come into play there, as well as a robust supply chain. With drug shortages emerging as a significant problem around the world, it's important to have multiple providers in the event of a drug shortage. And then finally, a level playing field so that all participants are encouraged to enter into competition, drug development, drug discovery, and discouraging mandatory discounts, which places downward pressure on that and incentives for manufacturers to enter this market to begin with, which ultimately and long-term results in less competition, less price competition, and less ability to manage costs. So, as mentioned in my introduction, the EU experience is often viewed as a success story, but the EU experience is often misinterpreted. A limited amount of that experience is used. And I would cite these 2 examples in Canada, where some Canadian provinces have begun to enter into tendering systems that require that patients be forcibly switched to the least expensive product based on that tendering process, and that product would be determined by the government through a tendering system. And similarly, in Australia, the Australian government has also implemented a forced switching patients, including for cancer patients. And so some of these reimbursement practices have resulted in manufacturers just saying, well, we can't do business in there because there's no way that we can generate any kind of profit to support our industry as well as develop new products. So the bottom line is that these highly restrictive practices have the potential to jeopardize the long-term stability of the biosimilars market in these countries, and ultimately have long-term negative consequences on the affordability and availability of biologic medicines to them. So with that, I will conclude and end my presentation and be happy to respond to questions when our panel convenes.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Schneider. I now have the privilege of introducing Chad Pettit, who is going to provide us with perspectives from industry. And I can think of virtually no one who could better provide some informed observations from the industry perspective. Chad serves as the Executive Director of Marketing for Amgen's Biosimilars Business Unit. And in that role, he leads the global biosimilars commercial team in developing global launch strategies and related work for a portfolio of over 10 different biosimilars. Chad is a recognized expert in biosimilars commercialization, market access for biosimilars, and the policy members that are required to facilitate both cost savings for the healthcare systems and for patients. So with that, I will turn it over to Chad.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we've really had a good discussion so far. There's so much good data that's been presented and discussed. Coming from Amgen's a global biotechnology company. We've got 4 decades of experience in research and development and manufacturing and reliably supplying both innovator and biosimilar medicines. And so it really puts us in kind of a unique place with a unique perspective as a leading company in terms of innovative medicine that continues to advance the care of patients, and also one of the largest stakes in biosimilars. We have 11 biosimilars now in our portfolio, either launched or in development. We've invested $2 billion at this point in those programs. In the US, 5 of them are approved, and outside the US, actually 5 are approved. In the US, we have 2 that have leading market share of 40 to 50%. And we, as a leader in biosimilars, every year we publish our Trends in Biosimilars report. We just put a preview on our website, which is amgenbiosimilars.com, for the 2022 report, which will come out in September. And so we've already seen a lot of data. I'm going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek of what's in our trend report, and just comment specifically on some perspectives that I think are in addition to what we've already heard. Before I do that, I just want to say, I really agree with the principles that Dr. Schneider laid out and that we've discussed here. Stakeholder confidence is really critical, which means appropriate regulatory standards. If we think about the marketplace, having a level playing field that just encourages competition between the reference product and the biosimilars is a foundational aspect to success in the marketplace. Scientifically accurate education is important, and we've seen that outside the U.S. and in the U.S. as a key factor as physicians and patients and payers and others become familiar with biosimilars. And then the fourth element, which I would add, is a marketplace, really a successful marketplace really needs a foundation of intellectual property. If there's not the motivation to discover and develop new innovative medicine, there won't be biosimilars down the road, and there also won't be the advancement in the treatment of care of patients. So just to comment, we've seen a lot of data so far. I just wanted to highlight a couple things. In terms of overall development programs, you've already seen there's 36 approved biosimilars. If you look at Europe at the same point in time, which is about 7 to 8 years into the since the first launch, Europe had 15. And I would argue that actually, if you time adjust, the U.S. is well ahead of Europe at this point in time. There's actually now 22 that have been launched, and almost 100 FDA programs that are in development, which really bodes well for the future of biosimilars. When we look at as I said, with Europe, we're actually the U.S. is ahead, and you can see here the comparison of the 15 approved in Europe to the 36 in the U.S. As we, I think I lost the slide here. Is there any way to put the slide back up? Okay, there we go. So as we look at so that's development programs. Then the next question I think you would logically ask is, okay, well, what kind of savings have biosimilars have produced? And what we're seeing is biosimilars are coming in 15 to 37% below the reference product list price in the US. They're 3 to 24% below the reference product ASP, which is a good proxy for net price. So good savings on the biosimilar side at launch. And then beyond launch, let's see if we could advance the slide somehow. Oh, there we go. Beyond launch, you can ask the question, okay, well, what happens with price? And what we're seeing is biosimilars have an annual price decline of 9 to 22%. And reference products that are competing with biosimilars have an annual price decline of 4 to 20%. And so it's really, I think, good data to support the idea that competition is really doing what competition is designed to do, which brings cost savings to healthcare systems. This is US data. It's very consistent with what we've seen outside the US. And so you've got good development programs, you've got price savings, cost savings that are coming, but you can't achieve that if you don't have uptake. And so when we look at how are biosimilars doing in terms of uptake, what we're seeing is if you look at products that launched in the early part of the U.S. Marketplace, they're achieving 38% share on average. If you look at products that have launched in the last 2 years, they're achieving over 60% share, which is really high. And when you look at some categories are converging at around 80% share, which can make sense. The reference product retains about 20%. And then with the variety of biosimilar competitors in the marketplace, the total biosimilar share then was achieving about 80%. So the uptake is very good. And so then the last question I guess I would ask is, well, what does it all mean? If we've got cost savings, we've got share uptake, what has it meant so far? A year ago, if we were talking, I would have been able to tell you that the biosimilars up until a year ago had saved the US healthcare system $9.8 billion. Just 1 year later, that number is now $18 billion. And so it's actually exponential growth in the cost savings that's being achieved for the US system. And that's consistent with what we're seeing outside the US. And so we've got the promise of biosimilars being fulfilled in terms of cost savings. What's the future? As we've already heard, we've got adalimumab biosimilars launching this next year. We have a number of other categories that are launching, including orphan products. So we're seeing what we will see now is in the US at least, expansion of biosimilars into pharmacy benefit reimbursement from drugs that are administered in an office setting. We're going to see more therapeutic areas. We're going to see the continued approval of interchangeable biosimilars. Provider education will continue. I think we're going to continue to see the impact of that. I think the use of real-world evidence which is at this point pretty robust, coming from Europe in particular, and starting to be fairly robust in the US also, will also be an important part of what we're going to see going forward. And so with that, just as introduction. If you want more information, the amgenbiosimilars.com website really has a lot of good information. If you need education around what biosimilars are, how they're manufactured, and then also our biosimilar trends report, which has been fairly widely cited, is also available there. So Stephen, I'll give it back to you.
Oh, great. Well, thanks again, Chad. That was very informative. So our last prepared remarks are going to come from Andrew Spiegel, who is going to help emphasize the important patient perspective on all of this and bring us back to what is really at stake with the biosimilars market. Andrew has served as a patient advocate for decades. He's been active at both the national level in the United States, but at the international level, working with healthcare regulators at the WHO and countries around the world. He currently serves as the executive director and was the co-founder of the Global Colon Cancer Association. But that's just one of many patient advocacy organizations that he is active with. He is currently the board chair of the World Patients Alliance, which is affiliated and active in over 110 countries around the world. He is the co-founder of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines and past chair for the Digestive Disease National Coalition. So with no further ado, Andrew.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me. Much of what I wanted to talk about has already been covered, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time rehashing. Oh, I lost my slides. What happened there? Oh, there we go. So I will spend a few minutes talking about the patient's perspective on biosimilar use. And what I wanted to talk about first is that we know that biologic medicines are an important part of the treatment paradigm for patients with many, many different diseases. More than 1 billion patients around the world have benefited from them. And in my arena, I run a global organization, an umbrella organization for all colon cancer patient advocacy groups worldwide. And we have seen improved outcomes in the colon cancer world as a result of the introduction of biologics and now biosimilar medicines. And the data shows that all of these new treatment choices are working. We've seen the average life expectancy of the metastatic colon cancer patient triple since the introduction of biologic therapies. So we're really excited about biologics. We're excited about biosimilars. And I've been involved in the biosimilar policy arena, as Stephen said, since the inception of ASBM back in 2010. And I've been involved in both regulatory efforts here in the States and also internationally. And one of the things that we want to make sure is that these biosimilar policies work for patients. It's actually the patients that take these medicines. So while everyone talks about physicians and payers and systems and those things, but the patients are actually the people that take it. So what do patients really care about? They care that these things are safe and effective. And we have to make sure that these biosimilar policies that are being developed worldwide work for these patients. And so we want to make sure that the standards for approval remain high, because so far we haven't had any major problems with biosimilars, and we want to keep it that way. Importantly, we want to maintain control over who makes patients' treatment decisions. We want physicians and patients to be in charge of treatment decisions. We don't want government making treatment decisions for us, or payers or regulators. We want the person that knows our bodies the most, the physician, to make individual decisions for us. And last, we want transparency. If we're going to be switched from an originator biologic to a biosimilar, or from one biosimilar to another biosimilar, we want to know about it, and we want our physicians to know about it. And so we do have concerns when it comes to unnecessary switching. And that is one of the things that we talk about when we talk about biologics and biosimilar medicines. We know that for some people, it's taken years and years to find a medicine that works right for them. And so all of us here speak from the gastrointestinal space, the colorectal cancer, bowel cancer space, but I've been on many panels over the last decade where other specialties like rheumatology talk about an autoimmune system, autoimmune diseases, and those folks talk about how many patients take years to find the right medicine that works for them to control their disease. And for those patients that are taking perhaps 10, 15, 20 drugs a day to have a somewhat normal life, they don't want their cocktail messed with. That's the best way to say it. They don't want something that's working for them to be changed for the sole purpose of saving someone some money and not the patient. So that's a major concern for the patient community, because we know that changes in therapy could lead to an immune response or a loss of response, and that could expose the patient to maybe no therapies or less effective therapies, or having to go to more serious treatment options. So these are some of the things that patients are concerned with when we talk about the switch to biosimilars. But we know that from other speakers, education is the key. And my organization, in conjunction with the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines and the World Patients Alliance, put on a 2-day biosimilar training program just 2 months ago in May. And it was a 6-hour, 2-day interactive training program, and it was geared toward patient advocates so that they would be able to share the information that we presented them with the millions of patients that they represent, in order to fill these gaps in education and an awareness of what biosimilars are. So for those who are watching, I would recommend that you go to learnbiosimilars.org. You can watch these 18 videos covering education, policy issues. There's patient advocates talking. A lot of the speakers today you'll find in that training session. And you will learn a lot about how patient advocates feel, and you'll see a lot of the data that's been talked about today about how patient advocates feel about biosimilars and switching and things of that nature. But some of the key things that came out of that training experience are several. First, we looked at patients in Europe, and we found that patients in Europe seem to have the most positive feelings about biosimilars being used in their countries. Patients in the US seem to be generally positive as well. Patients in Canada were more concerned about some of the things that are happening in Canada that I'm going to talk about in a second, the forced switching situation. And then we had an advocate who runs Bowel Cancer Australia, who's been very involved in the biosimilars policy arena. And he talked about a very negative experience where a drug was literally pulled from the market in Australia because a biosimilar came out, and the originator really gave a week's notice to stage 4 cancer patients that they were going to lose their therapy. So all of those experiences are discussed at learnbiosimilars.org. We take a little bit of a deeper dive. We see that we had the CEO of ECPC, the European Cancer Patient Coalition, and we had the CEO of Digestive Diseases Europe talk about the European experience. And the key takeaways were that the European governments generally permit the physicians to choose the most appropriate biologic medicine for a patient. And they choose between an originator and a biosimilar, and all of those will be reimbursed by the payer. And lower cost medicines, which are usually biosimilars, are encouraged for new patients, and sometimes quotas are put in place to encourage this. There was discussions about switching being made collaboratively with education of patients to build trust in biosimilars, and as well as the savings that are being attributed to biosimilars being reinvested into the system so that there can be more healthcare workers, there could be more coverage for patients that need access to certain drugs, there could just be more access overall. And so the notion from the Europeans were that it's been a very positive experience for them. In the US, I spoke along with Anna Hyde from the Arthritis Foundation, and we again agreed that biosimilars, as Chad has said, are attaining significant market share in the United States. Competition is increasing. It's creating savings that Chad just discussed, incredible savings, $18 billion, I think Chad said. So we're really excited about the cost savings that the biosimilars are attaining in the United States. And we're excited that physicians and patients are starting to feel confident in the United States about biosimilars. There is still concern about non-medical switching by private payers, health insurers, government, pharmacy benefit managers. But as I talked about, there are ways to properly switch a patient, and all of that is addressed at the training seminar. I was very involved in going state to state here in the United States back in the day, making sure that the state substitution laws were put in place that would only allow interchangeable biosimilars to be automatically substituted at the pharmacy level. And we also advocated state by state to make sure that physicians were made aware of any changes in the patient's treatment. Then we went to Canada, and we had Gail Atara from the Gastrointestinal Society, who's been very involved in biosimilars policy arena for more than a decade. As many know, 4 provinces have adopted a forced switching policy. I believe about the only places in the world that this has happened. And the BC policy, the British Columbia policy, was the most restrictive for sure. There were no exceptions. Alberta offered some exceptions for children and pregnant women, but the patient community, particularly the GI community, joined by many physicians, pushed back heavily on these policies, but the policies are still scheduled to take place. Surveys have been done by patient organizations, physicians, and there really is quite a movement against this forced switching by the government. We really feel that these decisions should be made on an individual basis by the patient and by their healthcare provider, not by governments looking to save money. And then I briefly touched on the Australian experience, where Julian Wiggins from Bowel Cancer Australia talked about how biosimilars were rolled out in the United States, how there was automatic substitution being allowed over the objections of physicians and patients, and how physicians block these forced switches. And he even talked about how manufacturers have pulled their products, one for liability reasons and one after a biosimilar manufacturer came in at a lower price. And the originator just simply said, we're going to take our ball and bat and go home. And all these stage 4 cancer patients were forced to switch to another drug. There was no grandfathering, and this was quite a disappointing and bitter thing when you have a stage 4 cancer patient who's stable on medicine, and then the government comes in and wants to change their medicine because there weren't sufficient safeguards in place to prevent a manufacturer from pulling out of the market simply because a biosimilar manufacturer came in at a cheaper rate. So in summary, patients do support biosimilars. We're excited about them. There's more treatment options. There's cost savings to the systems, which should translate into increased access for patients and better healthcare overall for patients. So we do support biosimilars, and we are excited about them. But they have to come with policies that work for patients, especially with respect to substitution and switching. Patients have generally expressed a strong satisfaction with the way Europe has done it, making biosimilars available and achieving uptake and achieving cost savings and achieving access for more patients to get therapies in their system without sacrificing the sanctity of the patient-physician choice and the patient-physician relationship. And we know that in the US, patients are optimistic about biosimilars. The survey data has shown that, our data has shown that, and there have been success in controlling automatic substitution of non-interchangeable biologics, and we will continue working to limit non-medical switching when the sole purpose for that switching is to save a payer money and not for the patient's benefit. And we talked about the experience of Canada and Australia, which should serve as a warning to patients, to physicians, to regulators, to policymakers all around the world about the dangers of government prioritizing short-term savings over long-term sustainability, and of course, most importantly, eroding patient trust in biosimilars. We know that education is the key for physicians, for patients, for policymakers, for these issues. And we know that hearing from patients and patients' experiences are critical. So I do again invite everybody to go to learnbiosimilars.org. That is a standalone website that has all of the materials and all of the presentations I talked about today. There's even a biosimilar toolkit for patient advocates to learn everything they need to know about biosimilars and change policy with regulators. So again, thank you for inviting me to participate, and I will turn it back over to Stephen, I believe, for questions.
Well, thanks, Andrew. That was very helpful. Yes, we're moving to the section of our program now where we can ask questions of our panelists and promote some discussion about the issues that we've heard about and maybe explore a few new issues. What I'd like to do, as I've been watching some of the questions come through, is start off with a question that I'd like to direct this towards Eric and perhaps Chad, but welcome everyone else to jump in. So when listening to the panel's comments, there's been a lot of there's been a lot of comments about the importance of promoting competition and getting more and more biosimilars on the marketplace. So it seems to beg the question, do we reach a point where we should revisit the standards that we're imposing to become a biosimilar and try to slide those downward to try to promote even more competition? You know, the idea being that if we loosen the standards a bit by which we're grading the biosimilars to enter the marketplace, maybe we'll get even more, right? And so I was hoping maybe Eric, you can lead us off in commenting about that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously, if you lower standards, you can get more competitors, but I don't think that would be a route that has yet been considered, to be honest, in discussions, because one, you've got a relatively young field, and as we've been hearing, you know, patients have to have confidence in the products here in the biosimilar area. I don't, you know, I don't know what others think, but I don't think that particularly at this time, that the idea of lowering standards to increase the number of competitors, especially when, as I have indicated in my presentation, you actually are seeing real savings as a result of the current regime without lowered standards. So, you know, when you're getting savings right now and you're starting to see more and more of them in the future, I think kind of a wait and see for something like that. As heavily as we leaned into choice and competition, I mean, to be clear, right, that was one of the emphases that we were tasked with, at least in our administration out of the White House. There's a giant, you know, sort of report on it, on choice and competition, and really market orientation. You'd say, we want more competition, but I think we are getting that under the current regime, which does not implicate lowering standards to do so. You can certainly go way too far in that. Anyway, I'll defer. I don't want to use up all the time there.
Yeah, let me just comment. You know, I don't personally think that lowering standards will really help anything. I actually think it will hurt the system. You need the confidence for patients and physicians, and lowering standards would hurt that. I also don't think that commercially it really would create any additional savings. I think if you look at the 9 different classes of medicines and you look at the data there, the cost savings, regardless of whether it's a few or many biosimilars, are pretty consistent. So once you have a couple competitors, you have pretty consistent savings. And where the opportunity really lies is in having more biosimilars in more therapeutic areas. So it's not about cost saving. It's not about trying to lower the bar and somehow introduce a lot more competitors within a certain class. It's creating opportunities so that manufacturers invest in a lot of classes of biosimilars.
And if I can, I'll add something, lessons that we started learning. This is under 43. So I'll give you an example, and this carried through into our administration. So for example, in PEPFAR, when we were doing under George Bush, we did the AIDS relief for Africa, right? There was certainly pressure at that time for us to lower standards on the types of drugs that we would allow in, even into a purchase program funded by the US, but not inside the US. People said, hey, if we can use these cheap, knockoffs, we can get more drugs, serve more people. Absolutely not. We would not do that. We wouldn't even count that's for people in overseas, right? In aid, in relief programs. And that definitely came from FDA at the time, and that's carried right through. I mean, it's still an issue, and that's not even counting this area, which is even more, creates more sort of electricity around it. So anyway, just to echo what Chad just said, what I don't know about that.
Steve, I would just like to add, and I know Andy has been with me in presentations across Europe where we have had conversations with EMA regulators, where we have had meetings with the WHO on the issue of standards, on the issues of pre-qualification, reducing the standards in developed countries for biosimilars. The position of ASBM has always been, and I've literally been in panel discussions with the EMA regulators where they argue that it's a moral question. And the moral question is that you need to acknowledge that basically countries that do not have access need, some access, and even if that access is diminished standards. And the position that we took, and I remember this particular slide, Andy, you probably do as well in Dublin, where our last bullet point said no easy point of access. And the regulator came running over to the microphone and said, well, what do you mean by that? Disagreeing with that point. And I said, it means that, because you are a country with less resources does not mean you should be receiving medicines that are not to the standards of other countries. And we take the exact opposite position. So there is, especially in Europe, especially at the WHO, and even within the EMA, basically an argument that it's a morality question to lower the standards. We take the exact opposite position, that the floor is the floor. And if you lower those standards, how far do you lower them before you have made a mistake that, to Chad's point, undermines confidence?
As a physician, I have to agree with that. Everyone gets treated equally. We all, even in the United States, which has so much, we have differences in rural areas, et cetera. And I'm sure Andy can speak on this too. People want confidence in the healthcare system. And if we need to change the access methods, that's one thing. But to put out lesser standards is just not right from a physician standpoint. You can't do that.
The one issue related to quality is not necessarily an arguable case is lowering the quality, but is reducing the emphasis on clinical trials for biosimilars as opposed to using analytics or analytics only. And that's where the current debate is being held. And the theory is that for biosimilars to establish equivalency, analytics are more effective actually than clinical trials, and that they're not necessary. I don't agree with that, but that's the argument that I've been hearing, and it's starting to emerge in the EU. So whether that's a lower standard or not is a debate, but the scientists would argue that analytics are a more precise way to determine biosimilarity than expensive and lengthy clinical trials.
And the only thing I would add is, Mark, Chad, you're the marketing guy. To me, it seems like this whole biosimilars thing, this bubble keeps getting bigger and bigger, more manufacturers, more drugs being approved, and the last thing we want is to pop that bubble with a bad experience. And that's all it will take is one bad experience in the biosimilars because they lower standards somewhere. And I remember being at the WHO, and I remember some of the regulators from South America calling for lower standards. And And I remember thinking exactly what Michael has said, that why should they have lower standards because they don't have as much money in South America as, say, US or EU or Canada? Why should they get a lower standard drug or drugs approved with lower standards? And it's not only not fair, but it's dangerous, because if there's a bad experience in a biosimilar anywhere, it's going to affect the whole world, the whole biosimilar market in the world, because all of a sudden patients are going to be scared of them, physicians are going to be scared of prescribing them, and the system's working. So leave it alone. That's my perspective.
From a physician standpoint, we want trust in the FDA and the regulatory bodies as well. If they create dual standards or lesser standards, and we see that, then we don't know what to do. We already see in the physician data that there's a level of concern. We need more data for interchangeability, et cetera. And to say now we're going to create a double standard, how do we do this? I understand the idea of analytics, et cetera. Things change. We used to just do studies and we did meta-analyses. Data methods change. Big data is going to change the world, but we can do it in a stepwise fashion and look at the validity of that. And we want trust in the system. Everyone, all of the stakeholders here today want to trust the system.
Yeah, I just want to close on this particular point, Steve, is that the conversations that we've had with the WHO and the EMA regulators, it is always kind of surprising that they're arguing basically to make different standards, but not within the EU. You know, the WHO talks about where they should be applying these different standards. And our point is, you know, it's kind of like not in my backyard. We want the standards. We'll send them to Africa or Latin America or wherever where they have access issues. And ultimately, the reality is you don't adjust standards that are working well. It's not just for the fact that, you know, this is not about ultimately just getting more competitors in the field. It's making sure ultimately that patients and physicians have the confidence in the products, and that in order for you to be able to compete and to manufacture and approve products, that you can meet a threshold that's been determined to be successful.
Well, super. That was a great discussion. One of the things that I'm seeing come up in the questions has to do with provider education. And maybe I'll ask Dr. McKibben to lead this discussion off. But we saw a lot of information today about the important role that the physician providers play in adoption and uptake. And so, Dr. McKibben, what sort of medical education topics or initiatives, or what do you see as key to be to help drive physician acceptance and their ability to make reasoned decisions, either for or against the use of biosimilars?
I think the cornerstone of that is going to be transparency into every step of the process. We have this responsibility to have a conversation, an informed consent conversation with our patients. I need to understand the risks and benefits. Yes, there are cost data to the system, but I have that responsibility to give true data to my patients. And I always say, I read the menu, they order. And so that would be the preferred thing, is that they have choice. So we need to know, one, comparative data between agents. Well, on biosimilars, that's going to be hard. It's all the same. And maybe analytics will help. But we need to see the safety data always. That's the number one concern. Long-term safety data that this is working. We need to see information about questions. You know, one of the things about generic drugs is that the binders and additives into the medication can cause side effects, like with celiac. The medication's the same, but the binders are different. So additional data in manufacturing, processing, the pharmacovigilance, which Professor Schneider champions. You know, do we want to be able to track these things, look for side effects? We need education on how to get these agents. How are we going to track the agents? If it's being changed at the pharmacy, where's that being recorded? Who's reporting the data? We don't have a true big picture of bad outcomes because the reporting for bad outcomes is not reliable. I think that needs to be strengthened, et cetera. So the education, I think, is getting physicians to participate in the process and give us transparency into each of those steps, because different people will have different issues, but that will build the trust in the providers. And we are stakeholders. We sit on the pharmacy committees, et cetera, but we're also in the room with the patients. and we want to trust the other people in the chain, if you will, like the pharmacy and the pharmacy benefit managers, et cetera. We need to know what you guys are doing and how it works and build those trust. And that's relationships, that's stakeholder education. So each step along the way, I think, is the cornerstone.
Can I jump in on that too, Dr. McKibben, just to add, because really one of the things I said in my presentation in the beginning is that ASBM from its inception, and Andy was there right at the very beginning, was we wanted to basically present data. We wanted to share data. We saw our target as policymakers in particular, as regulators, as health ministers, and that's what we have done. What is interesting though is that, oftentimes you have a situation where you look to Australia in the beginning, when we went over and met with the Australian regulators, when they first started, there was the opportunity for physicians to, and by the way, the policymakers in the beginning said, if the physician has to make the additional step of put dispense as written, they're not going to do it. So they gambled with the policy, which is to give them that opportunity, but to basically say to their constituents, well, the physician can opt out. But assuming they wouldn't, and basically have a force switch policy with an opt-out provision, what happened? The physicians, and we went over and met with the physicians over there, 98% of them hit dispense as written, because they said, there is an absence of data that we need. And I think a lot of the conversation around data is the difference between the presence of data, which is to say, what data can you show us that biosimilars are working effective? What is that overall data? Who's presenting that data? How do we know it's unbiased or whatever? Those who have really kind of pushed biosimilar only programs have talked about the absence of data, which is the absence of negative data. And to your point, and certainly Eric and I know, having worked with the FDA, having data out there, even if it's adverse event data or other data, how is it compiled? How can you access it? Do the doctors do the reports? All of that stuff. And so what physicians have really looked for is the presence of data versus the absence of negative data. Say we have a 15-year experience with biosimilars and nothing bad has ever happened. You've heard that out there where they say nothing bad has ever happened. That's a credibility issue, because obviously there are things in general with every aspect of medicine where things have happened. It's just the level of confidence that physicians need in saying, we believe that this data, which is why, by the way, even when we were in Australia talking with physicians who were against forced switching, meaning the program they had, when we described to them interchangeable biosimilars, they said we would have a completely different perspective if that was allowed. And we literally talked with the Department of Health and the TGA about what if Australia simply accepted an interchangeable biosimilar from the US as an interchangeable biosimilar, because the physicians already knew that additional data went in to making that determination.
Could I play off a little bit of what you were just talking about, Michael? We've seen some questions come in about what data exists in different parts of the world, and you can imagine that different countries are at different stages in the development of their biosimilars market. Can you comment? Maybe you and Dr. Schneider could comment a little bit on, when is the appropriate time for an emerging market to start working on collecting data, and how would you, knowing what you know now, how would you roll that out in a region of the country that's of the world that's just starting to grapple with some of this?
I'll start with an actual experience that we had in Alberta. Andy, I think you were there in 2013. They had someone come in from Norway and talk about the Norway approach. And the question that I posed to the regulator from Norway was, when you have a tender system and you basically why not make the tender contingent upon saying that we will collect data at the end of that tender system, which then has some value with regards to being able to show how the system worked, what were the outcomes for the patients. We actually asked the regulator, you could make it a condition preceding upon, if you get the tender, you have to commit to that. They said, well, we asked the manufacturers, and they said, no, they weren't going to do that. That was too cumbersome. Of course, we're saying, well, why don't you make it a condition? And so then the question came up just generally, boy, you would think with the way biosimilars have been sold kind of globally from the beginning, to me, it's been as a policy in a healthcare background, it's been more of a PR campaign than a data-driven campaign. And to answer the question, I would say that it's shocking to me that there wasn't from the get-go. The minute you begin the process, look to the Canadian experience as an example. They talked about, well, people said, well, we don't like the forced switching approach. How are we going to know what's the result of forced switches? And they said, well, we're going to do monitoring of increased hospitalizations. I mean, we've had conversations recently about what does that look like? How we just had COVID for 2 years. How are you? I mean, these programs in BC and Alberta were implemented right pre-COVID, and you're saying we're going to do, we're going to monitor increased hospitalizations and be able to attribute those to something happening regarding a switch. There really hasn't been a serious conversation, in my opinion, by those who are really pushing for heavy biosimilars, kind of biosimilars only programs, to have that responsibility. And certainly if you're a manufacturer that is basically trying to get into this space, the more the data can be something as simply as having a relationship with physicians who understand a particular product or the history of a manufacturer over a period of time, where they basically say that in the absence of that data, we have to go with the names that we trust or the manufacturers that we trust or whatever. And so right now, there's an advantage for those who basically have the credibility of kind of long-term success in the space. But there is clearly globally the absence of that type of data that you are talking about, Steve. And that's true in Canada, that's true in Norway, that's true across the globe.
One of the issues that's been raised has to do with shortages. Right now, although it doesn't involve biologics, everybody in the US is hearing every day about shortages of baby formula. Can't believe that we're struggling with something like that. But over the last decade, shortages with traditional drugs has been an issue in the cancer community. I imagine it kept Eric awake at night at times in his role with the government. But I was wondering if Professor Snyder and Eric could comment a little bit about, with the rising concern about potential shortages, how does regulatory policy involving biologics and biosimilars play into all that?
I could give a first shot at that because I attended a webinar yesterday by the FDA on drug shortages. And one of the pieces of information that was shared that was of interest to me was the report of an FDA task force on drug shortages that produced a report that was released on July 17th, 2018. And it included two things. One was root causes of drug shortages based on their analysis of this issue. And secondly was to make recommendations. So two of the root causes that were listed, and I'm reading this because I printed this out because I thought it was important. As a root cause, it's the lack of incentives for manufacturers to produce less profitable drugs. So that gets into this issue of the sustainability of the product and using tendering systems that drive profit out of the systems to the point where manufacturers don't want to be there and there aren't people making these medicines. And then the third root cause analysis was logistical and regulatory challenges that make it difficult for the market to recover from a disruption. And then a couple of recommendations that were included in this report was a recommendation to create a shared understanding of the impact of drug shortages on patients and the contracting practices that may contribute to shortages, and the need to promote sustainable private sector contracts with payers, purchasers, and group purchasing organizations to make sure that there's a reliable supply of medically important drugs. So it was interesting that this comes from the FDA that has an approval process for safety and effectiveness, and looking at the marketplace and the impact of a lack of competition or a lack of available products as root causes of the of drug shortage problems that we're seeing in our country and probably others as well.
Yeah. I would say, like, echo that. I mean, obviously, as 2018, I was there in the department at the time that came out, and I would say that some of the things dealing at least with the logistical side, if we don't see a lot more attention to onshoring medical production into the U.S., a drive for that here, I would be surprised in terms of. And it was something that I'm sure Michael remembers, the flu vaccine shortage in 04, fall of 04 and winter of 04. That was a lesson learned back then. It was forgotten. And I think the concern would be it's forgotten all over again, in spite of what we just went through as a country with regard to not just these kinds of medical products, but just very broadly. And in this case, I mean, as I would say, we found that the more sophisticated the product was, the more likely it was we were able to have good access to it. The less sophisticated and the more widely available in terms of the product, the less likely it was to be produced in the U.S. Hence those shortages that Professor Schneider pointed out at the very beginning. The low-cost ones and the more broadly available, the less likely it was, the more likely we were to have shortages, which is one of the strangest paradoxes that we had in the pandemic, and then of course before. This report is from 2018. So we were already considering these problems actually well before the pandemic really highlighted them for the public generally and made the issue very urgent as we were trying to respond in the middle of this. Don't want to drag it into personal PPE and all the other things. It was just as bad in the area of biologics.
Let me comment from a manufacturer perspective. Manufacturers compete on price, but also on other very critical factors for biosimilars that include manufacturing and reliability of supply. And the reality is not all of the manufacturers are going to play all the keys on the keyboard, so to say. And so, as you look in various marketplaces, some of the government policies that tilt the playing field or restrict competition or don't allow for just a robust competitive marketplace, it actually can trigger and create situations where shortages are more likely. And an example of that would be all or nothing tenders in Europe, where you pick a single product, as opposed to countries that have multi-winner tenders. And there's other examples also. And so I would just say, manufacturers are all competing, and they all have different levels of investment in how they manufacture and the way that they ensure reliable supply.
That's great.
Well, with that, I see that we're running a little bit over our allotted time. I'll thank all of our participants here and everyone who's tuned in. Let me turn things over to Michael. He opened us up, and if you had any parting remarks, but before I turn it over to Michael, I wanted to remind everybody about the upcoming webinar on July 20th, where we can pick up on some of these issues.
Yeah, and I just want to thank everybody again, the panelists and the participants, the folks who have taken the time to join us this morning. One pledge I know Steve made and we discussed is that all of the questions will be answered. So we will get back. I've been trying to kind of send some answers back as we're going, but it's a little difficult in terms of participating and also answering questions at the same time. So we will respond to every question that was submitted. I do appreciate the questions. And again, thanks to everybody for taking the time, and I look forward to seeing some of you in the next webinar on July 20th. Final thank you to Lazia Tang from GaBI, who has really spent a tremendous amount of time on this, putting this program together. 6 hours disadvantaged from us in the East Coast, and 9 from others, and even more. So thanks, Lazia, and thanks to everyone else, and see you soon.
Thank you.